Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to today's webinar. My name is Leroy, and I'll be your presenter today for the path to allyship, how to empower men to be change makers. So right before we start, I want to do a land acknowledgement. The land I am leading this webinar on is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I want to give a quick subject matter warning. While the content today isn't very heavy, the topics in general are. So if you need to step away or take care of yourself, please do so. Here are some resources and other kind of support systems that you could use. I've used them in the past, found them very helpful. So learning objectives for today. What are we actually going to be talking about? First, we're going to be talking about healthy masculinity, what that means and what it looks like. Then we're going to talk about what does it take to be an effective ally and service provider, and put that in there. And how do we engage men in the conversation of gender-based violence? And also, if you have any questions, just put it in the chat box and we can get to it right at the very end. A quick self-disclosure. So I like doing this because I always find it important to address why we all do this kind of work. So as you already know, my name is Leroy. The reason I do this work is because I come from a family where gender-based violence was a constant in my household. So I grew up protecting my mother from my alcoholic father. As a result, I combated my own addictions and I've since recovered from them. But the reason I'm even here today, even talking to you here, is because in large part of my mother and so many other people that have empowered me to make a difference. I do this work because as a male-identified person, I feel it is important to use my own power, my privilege to educate, hopefully, other men and male-identified folks of the role that they can play in ending gender-based violence. So jumping right in then. I like this definition quite a lot, and I think it's a good starting point. So, domestic violence is a pattern of behavior used by one person to gain power and control over another person with whom he or she or they has or has had an intimate relationship. The behavior may include physical violence, sexual, emotional, and psychological intimidation, verbal abuse, stalking, and using electronic devices to harass or control. While I like this definition a lot, I do want to add just a few things. I want to add in there financial and status abuse, at least within the immigrant and refugee sector, which is, I imagine, a lot of the attendees here today. It's also important to include the names of all and the names of all different forms of abuse in order to hopefully identify them. Additionally, it's also important to note that domestic violence happens across all races and ethnicities, and not just in the immigrant and refugee community. Being service providers that focus solely on immigrant and refugees, we can't lose sight of the societal issue while also focusing on it as an individual issue. So, this is what we're really here for, the causes of unhealthy masculinity. We've used the term toxic. For me, as much as I see the value in toxic, at least when I talk to male-identified folks and males, toxic doesn't sit well. So I'm trying to use unhealthy as a form of education. So unhealthy or toxic masculinity starts from childhood experiences. I'll use myself as an example. I grew up with an abusive father, and I saw violence almost every day. At that time, I didn't know what it meant or why it was happening or even how to stop it. However, I did know that I had to protect my mother, so I did just that. However, in this process, my childhood experiences were reinforced by these implicit and explicit gender norms, societal norms. As a man, I'm supposed to be strong and in charge. I'm supposed to not cry or show any emotion, undue emotion. As a man, I'm supposed to have everything together, basically. So while I was the protector, I also shrugged away with what is meant to be a quote unquote proper man. Now, these norms are pushed by society, like I mentioned, and by social circles, and coupled with the pressure to comply to these stereotypes. As a result, I became closed off and emotionally disconnected, and that's where and how I created my personal identity. And while I was never an abuser, I conformed to what it means to be a proper man, which affected my life quite dramatically. So, all this to say, unhealthy masculinity or toxic masculinity is learned behavior. Now, as a child growing up in these experiences, for some reason I empathized with my mother instead of my father, and I decided that violence against women was wrong. No one along the way throughout my childhood told me it was wrong, and there were no conversations about it. It was just normal everyday life for me. However, when we understand that masculinity is learned behavior, it's cultivated by all these different factors. Another person with similar experiences as mine could have easily become an abuser. This hypothetical man could have seen and experienced violence against women every day, much like I did, and rationalized it much like his male role models did. And so going even further, while parenting does play a huge role within masculinity, young men and boys can be influenced by a number of factors in their earlier years. Social circles, so other men, father figures and other men, mainstream media, and other things. So this distinction is important to understand as we, as service providers, begin to engage men in the conversation of gender-based violence. That unhealthy masculinity is in fact learned, and so it can be unlearned. So for service providers, as a service provider, trying to make a change in gender-based violence for immigrant and refugee men and boys specifically, it's crucial to identify and understand the root causes of their behavior, first and foremost. Then it's important to challenge their belief system around masculinity and femininity. It's important to challenge this because we have to redefine together what masculinity means. If no one challenges it and redefines it, then these behaviors continue to go unchecked. It's important to understand social norms and pressure and how to deal with it effectively. Because, again, coping mechanisms, if I conform to social norms or don't understand how to deal with social norms, I'm more likely to be an abuser. I'm more likely to use the same behavior and continue the same behavior as my quote-unquote negative role models. Lastly, it's important to provide education and resources. Now, many agencies go directly with the resources first, but I find that it doesn't work. If men cannot understand their behavior in the first place, they won't be able to connect with the resources, the education, and support. So understanding the root causes is really important for your behavior because as service providers, we all just rush straight into education, and it ends up being disconnected for the abuser or disconnected for men in general and male-identified folks. So in order to make effective change as service providers, we have to understand the person behind the abuser. So as service providers, then, trying to make change in gender-based violence for immigrant and refugee boys and men and boys, it's crucial to understand the root causes of their behavior first and foremost. Oh, this is the same slide. It's the same slide. Okay. So, how to be an effective service provider? First, we have to acknowledge the social and economic disadvantage, especially among newcomers and immigrants. We have to acknowledge that as a newcomer, male, female, they, them, it's hard, and there are disadvantages that could contribute. Next, it's important and crucial to include culturally relevant content when addressing gender equity. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a room where the content may be designed for men, for me, but not designed for an immigrant man, with specific issues and specifically addressing cultural relevancy. Then it's important to recognize challenges pertinent to racism and intersectional disadvantage. What does that mean? That basically means that there's a set of challenges that we as immigrant and refugee folks face every single day that maybe our white or other race counterparts doesn't face. And lastly, and most importantly in my opinion, is using strength-based approaches when engaging men in the community. By using strength-based approaches, we empower people. We empower people and we empower men to understand about themselves, educate themselves, and stop perpetuating and perpetrating gender-based violence. So, the path to allyship. Let's figure out how to engage more men in this conversation. How do men and boys, service providers and otherwise, become allies and support systems for women and women-identified folks when it comes to gender-based violence? I made a short video highlighting some of the possible roles. It's a little bit fun.
I'm a change maker by educating myself and others.
I'm a change maker by organizing and showing up to rallies.
I'm a change maker by inviting men to have conversations.
I am a change maker by telling stories of gender-based violence.
I am a change maker by listening compassionately when people share their stories.
I am a change maker by talking to other male friends.
I am a change maker by supporting and donating to local organizations.
I am a change maker by listening to survivors.
I am a change maker by believing survivors.
I am a change maker by believing survivors.
I am a change maker by believing survivors. Let us end gender-based violence together.
So on this note, it's important to realize that everyone can be an effective ally, that you don't need to have a powerful role or position or anything even attached to the end of your name to do these simple things. It's full screen. It's not full screen. So then, how do we engage more men in this conversation? I can't stress this enough. We need to be having more conversations with our male and male-identified friends in our social circle. In order to deconstruct and change gender-based violence, we have to be willing to engage and have these uncomfortable conversations about unhealthy or toxic masculinity with our male friends. From there, we can engage and organize together in solidarity. And when I say organizing, I don't mean that every man needs to attend rallies and protests and go all rah, rah, rah. While organizing and engagement can look like that, we can also organize and engage on social media. Everyone has a huge voice to stand up for gender-based violence and whatever it looks like, whether it's a Facebook post, a Twitter thing, or engaging in comments with perpetrators and perpetuators. And when we're engaging in these circles, it's important, first and foremost, to take up less space when women are sharing. Most importantly, it is crucial to believe survivors. I can't stress this enough. All too often, I'm in conversations where men question women about their clothing, behavior, and other things that are completely unrelated when we're talking about gender-based violence. In actuality, there's a reason why gender-based violence occurs. But when we engage in these conversations where we question women about any sort of aspect while they're a survivor or a victim of it, it's counterintuitive to what we're trying to do here. And when we're in a situation where a disclosure, does in fact happen, it's important to use these phrases first and foremost. I believe you is the strongest thing a male ally can say to a survivor. Outside of any support or resource, believing a survivor empowers them to hopefully get out of that situation. It's not your fault. Reinforces that the survivor is not at fault for facing any form of violence that there is no reason that in no reason she should have faced in the first place. And she needs to hear that because maybe the abuser told her that it's her fault, that she deserved it. How can I help you? It's so crucially important. Instead of suggesting supports first, ask her what she needs. Listen and take direction from her. And if she doesn't know a starting point, then you can make suggestions. But remember, not decisions. It's important to give and build a sense of autonomy for the survivor. And thank you for trusting me, and I'm sorry this is happening to you, are both statements that show your ability to connect with her, and it helps build more trust and compassion between you. Disclosure is hard. Disclosure is uncomfortable. A lot of people don't disclose because they don't know that their emotions or their stories will be believed, will be held, will be supported. And so these phrases, at least for me, are really good starting points when I deal with disclosure. Real social change. It is possible. It feels hard, it feels difficult and really, really heavy at times. But I like to believe that real social change is possible. I like to believe that if we can continue on this path, if we can learn our behaviors, if we can challenge social norms, if we can educate others as males and male-identified folks, real social change can happen. And I believe it is happening. Starts slowly. Starts with us. Through one workshop at a time, one person at a time, it's possible. Change can happen, and I know it's possible. So now, if anyone has any questions, I can try my best to answer them, hopefully. I cannot hear you.
That must have been at the beginning.
I hope so.
Yeah, because no, this is.
Can anyone hear me? Can everyone hear me all right? Does anybody got any questions? Alright, so I guess we can just wrap it up then.
Oh, here's
Oh,
a question.
question.
Okay, great. What are some ways that male-identified allies can intervene?
So the question is, what are some ways that male-identified allies can intervene?
When they hear oppressive language.
When they hear oppressive language associated with GBV from other men. Okay, so what is it? So what are some
ways? Okay, here it is. What are some ways that male-identified allies can intervene when they hear oppressive language? And there's another question.
So what are some ways that male-identified folks can intervene when they hear oppressive language? Oppressive language is a hard one because it can come in many different forms. And so it really depends on the social setting you're in. For me, at least when I hear oppressive language from my social circle, so from the group of men that I consider close, dear family and friends, I like to invite them in, call them in, versus calling them out. We're in such a call-out culture where we chastise people for oppressive language. I think it's important to call them in, at least within our social circles, and invite them in a conversation. Similar to the example of the toxic masculinity that I mentioned earlier, in my conversation with men and boys around this topic, the word toxic shuts the conversation down. It makes men feel like that it makes men feel like that everyone is an abuser and there's an innate fault. And so when I use the word toxic, it shuts conversation and education down. So in terms of oppressive language, if someone says, oh hey, like I don't believe you, or questioning behavior or questioning feelings or thoughts, it's important to call them in and address why they think that. Why did they come up with that? And how can we change this together? Because addressing it slowly.
Next question is, how can we engage men into these conversations? So here I mean with newcomer men who have not been associated with GBV.
How can we engage men into these conversations? So here I mean with newcomers who have not been associated with GBV. Well, I think it's the same way, right? It's the same. We have to engage all men in a similar way. At least with newcomers, as I mentioned earlier, it's making content or talking to people using a culturally relevant lens. So if they're not related to GBV and they have no understanding or background of it, it's introducing the topic of patriarchy, introducing the topic of societal harms slowly. I mean, when I engage in conversations with people, with newcomers that don't understand GBV or don't even think it's an issue, it's important to start small, using simple language and getting them there, like slowly educating them. Using words like patriarchy or toxic masculinity oftentimes goes over people's heads. And it's not wrong to say that. I think it's just important to use simple language to identify societal harms.
That's what I'm trying to, seems like the second half of a question, but rather to engage them and promote and deconstruct their behaviors.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all I can see from that one.
Okay.
Maybe we can ask the person.
So there's a
question.
There's a half of a question
From Gazwan.
from Gazwan.
Yeah.
It only says, but rather to engage them and promote and deconstruct their behavior. So what was the question there? If you wanted to re-put that in the chat again.
Okay.
Because it really got half of it for some reason.
Yeah, and then we have.
A really nice comment.
Yes, I think we can use digital media. Oh, here it is. Okay, here's another question. As an instructor in a classroom, how do you facilitate conversations when male or male-identified students make oppressive comments? How do you call in while setting boundaries?
How do you call in while setting boundaries? And
maintaining safety for other students.
And maintaining safety for other students. That's interesting because, at least in a previous workshop that I've done, there was a lot of opposition to some of these ideas and topics. It's still something that I struggle with, to be perfectly honest, and I kind of navigate it based on the situations. I find that, at least when you're educating in a classroom of students or a group of students, it's easy to lose sight of that one comment and make the entire workshop about that one comment. And while it's important to deconstruct that comment, for me, I try and use any sort of comment from any sort of student as a teaching tool for the rest of the class. And so I'll try to decontextualize that comment from the individual person and debate the actual thought and not the person. Because if that person is willing to share an oppressive thought or a harmful thought, it's important to use that because maybe other people feel the same way. And so in order to set boundaries, at least, it's something that, like I said, I still challenge and still struggle with. But it's giving space for that conversation to happen, to occur, so other people can now learn about maybe why that thought exists, because maybe that thought exists for other people, people aren't willing to share it. Others.
I think we might be waiting for the question to be retyped.
Oh, okay.
We'll give it a second.
Really small view, it's hard to see.
It is, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Maybe we should.
Give a couple more minutes, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds
Or-
good. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Comments?
Concerns?
Yeah.
Ways that I can do better? That's accepted too. Totally okay with that. Questions? Going once, going twice.
Oh.
Is there one more? Oh, I think there's one more. Hard to see.
How do we keep these conversations going?
Oh, that's hard. These questions are doozies. How do we keep the conversation going? Honestly, it's something that I struggle with because as tiring as these conversations, as challenging as they are, it's just trying to show up every single day, trying to take care of yourself in the process, but trying to show up every single day because these conversations are hard, even for me, and sometimes it is tiring, and so sometimes it's okay to take a break. But in terms of how do we keep it going, it starts with an understanding of self. It starts with me as a facilitator, as a person. How do I engage my best friend, my family members, other male-identified folks that I'm close with, or even coworkers who are male-identified and males, to challenge the behavior, to understand a little bit about themselves. And like my goal, at least, in every conversation is to hopefully get somebody else to question some aspect of their life. So when it comes to gender-based violence, if someone makes a comment or says something, or even has a question, a legitimate question, I try to not shut it down and even not even educate, but talk, have discourse, have a conversation between us, because both of us can leave that situation hopefully learning something. I think we got one more there.
Mhm.
I think so.
Okay. That's
Oh,
okay.
Oh.
Wow.
Oh,
Lots more.
questions.
Okay, this is
Okay.
great. Okay.
So that's the
Okay.
next
I would like you to comment on the recent 2 incidents where the father abducted their daughters. We had 2 incidents this year. Unfortunately, we lost one of the children. How do you take initiative to avoid such abductions situations?
We can't. Well, we can't avoid them. I wish we could avoid it. That's a tough question to address because there's a lot of different factors that are contributing to that. There's a lot of different factors that contribute to any sort of gender-based violence issue, right? And harm and violence, as sad as it is to say, it's happening and it continues to happen. But I hope through these conversations and through at least the attendees here, the few people that are here, entertaining my talk, hopefully that we can create a ripple effect that allows and creates an environment where these things can happen and shouldn't happen anymore. The reality is the reason that we're doing this work even now in 2019 after so many years of doing this is because these things continue to happen. And so, at least speaking personally for myself, I've made it my personal mission to educate people to the point where hopefully I can live in a future. I can live in a future where this stuff doesn't happen. And yeah, I mean, I just try and do my part the best I can. There's one more I think above that.
Above that? Okay, I work with men, but when we talk about GBV, they think that we are associating them with GBV. Some feel it is hard to talk about it, and they do not feel comfortable with the initiative. Okay.
That's true. I mean, as
or should you read the question? Sorry.
I can actually read the comment.
Okay.
So the comment was.
Okay.
So I work with men, but when we talk about GBV, they think that we are associating them with GBV. Some feel it is hard to talk about it, and they don't feel comfortable. Well, it's true. Honestly, I said earlier, while I'm not an abuser, I could have easily become one through all of my different life experiences. And so even having conversations about GBV, I also worry, and I think, well, do people think that I'm an abuser, or like what am I doing, right? And so like these conversations, as much as men are not associated with GBV, I think that's the important part about, at least for me, is restructuring and relabeling education and understanding how it fits with people. So again, going back right to the toxic masculinity conversation, toxic masculinity is everywhere, but I find that when I use that word, it shuts conversations down with men. And that's something that I really want to stress, is because, at least when it comes to education, using the word toxic masculinity automatically, it feels like it's attacking. And education can't happen when people are defensive. So instead, I like to promote things like unhealthy and healthy masculinity. So for me, instead of talking toxic, I talk unhealthy. I say, hey, here are the unhealthy ways that it can play out. Or conversely, you can say, here are all the healthy ways of masculinity. Here are all the healthy ways of masculinity. And immediately, anything outside of this idea of healthy masculinity, it now becomes unhealthy. And so you can use different ways of approaching people, and also not making them feel like they are part of the problem. Because ultimately, if you alienate people, you're not educating anybody. We got, I think we covered.
I think this conversation is going.
Hopefully we got questions.
Yeah.
Gotta talk about it, they don't feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Okay. So we got all the questions. Oh, there's one more. Oh. Okay, I think we got all the questions. One last look through.
Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Someone said thanks. That's very nice.
Hey.
Okay, so yeah, we'll wrap it up here, I guess. Thank you so much for giving me the time, the energy, your space. I appreciate it. I appreciate all the questions, the comments. This work is hard, and sometimes it feels like defeat, especially when we hear all of these scary incidences. So take care of yourself and take care of each other. And if you want to reach out, you can email me. That's my personal email, unfiltered. And or you can email Sidra Ahmad. She's the senior coordinator at Okazi for the initiative to end gender-based violence. So again, thank you so much for attending, giving me your time and energy, and hope to talk in the future. Have a good day.